Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and get my slides set up here. And we are on episode 12 today, looking at continuing the series about the FBI's role in the deep state plot to assassinate JFK, and then, of course, spinning it forward into the other assassinations into the 60s, basically uh, pulling in the FBI into this deep state uh, conspiracy or this I don't know what this unaccountable, unelected deep state that's making all these big decisions that would qualify as treason. And it's always been a mystery to me, and maybe I should rephrase that. It's a mystery to me now more so than it used to be, because when I was first studying the JFK assassination and all things related to this deep state, I didn't include the FBI in all of this. I assumed that if it had any role to play at all, it was just in the cover up. I had no idea how far back, how deep the tentacles went, how much Hoover's influence over the FBI had over the institution itself, and how deeply involved it was, and not just the cover up afterwards, but the laying the groundwork at the beginning, uh, carrying out certain aspects of the operation during, and then preserving the narrative afterwards. How important the FBI was to all of that. We've been looking at different questions. First question is, how did the CIA get away with a domestic operation? I used the word a as if it was a singular domestic operation, when in fact it was many. And it's, according to its charter, it's not supposed to operate domestically, and it's never supposed to target American citizens. And yet, in every one of these cases, from Operation Mockingbird, MK Ultra to Chaos to ZR Rifle, on and on, they always targeted American citizens. And how'd they get away with it when the intelligence agency that is supposed to operate domestically, that's its jurisdiction, is either negligent or it's permitting it, covering for it. And I've tried to make the case that I believe that the FBI was cover for the CIA, because they both shared the same agenda, which during the height of the Cold War era was anti-communism, anti-civil rights. And so if you go through the target list that we've gone through, you see that all of them share those two common characteristics. They are viewed as radicals or soft on communism, or full-fledged communists like Martin Luther King, and or they are advocating for civil rights. And so in every one of those cases, the FBI and the CIA shared a common goal, common agenda, which means their targets were identical. And they brought different expertise to these missions. The CIA had been assassinating foreign heads of state as a matter of practice for years. So they just brought that expertise home. The FBI had been rat fucking politicians and civil rights leaders for years. And when you merge those two expertise together, you end up with uh, the 60s, essentially, and even the 70s when you get into Watergate. So they got away with it because the FBI gave them cover. Second question was, how did Hoover's personal ambitions, politics, and connections contribute to the FBI's institutional motives to immunize the plotters in Dallas? And of course, this extends past Dallas. It gets into New York City with Malcolm X. It gets into Chicago with Fredhampton, and Memphis with Martin Luther King, and LA with Robert Kennedy, and also DC when it comes to Watergate. And when you really dig down deep and get into Hoover's personal ambitions, you see that it was just pure unadulterated power. That's really what it is, if you boil it down. He wanted to stay in power as long as possible. And he wanted to grow the FBI. And if you stood in his way, he would use blackmail, extortion, and or other means, up to and including assassination, evidently. His personal politics are extremely right wing, far right wing. You know, the anti-communist, anti-civil rights. Uh, that's where he lived. That was his presuppositional viewpoint, the lens through which he viewed the world. And so, since he led the FBI for 50 years, why are we surprised the FBI took on the uh, the attitudes and the approach of their leader? And then, lastly, his personal connections. We've gone to the Suite 8F crew, the highest ranking politicians, for example, coming out of Texas, but elsewhere as well, because they included people like Hoover and Richard Nixon. Nixon was not a Texas politician. It did have Texas politicians. LBJ was a national politician, but he's from Texas. John Connally was the governor, and there were state level officials as well. So you have these high level politicos. You also have these very high level business interests, big oil, Clint Murchison, H.L. Hunt, Harold Dryholes Bird, Sid Richardson. You had the military industrial complex coming out of Texas, right? The Brown and Root construction guys, the Bell helicopter guys, the General Dynamics guys. You have those people. And then you've got the mafiosos, the Carlos Marcellos, the Santos Traficantes, the Joe Savellas out of Dallas. Of course, that brings in Jack Ruby. All of these, the Frank Costellos, the BB Rebozos. So you have so much overlap here where the combination of his personal ambitions and his politics and his connections bled into the FBI from an institutional standpoint, and his agenda became the FBI's agenda. His targets became the FBI's targets. Why are we surprised COINTELPRO targeted civil rights organizations and radical organizations deemed as communist? Because those are the personal politics of J. Edgar Hoover. Why are we surprised that the FBI ignored these mafiosos, the organized crime element, the mafia, to the extent that Hoover even said there was no mafia, you know? So as goes Hoover, so goes the FBI. And so the third question was, were there any indications that the FBI had foreknowledge of what happened in any of these plots? But let's just say Dallas, for example. And a lot of it happened as a result of its own work, through its informants, through its wiretaps, through its sources in the Cuban community, also the mafiosos, the organized crime community, its contacts within big business. And of course, we know that J. Edgar Hoover had foreknowledge because he wrote a memo about Lee Harvey Oswald all the way back in '60 about somebody impersonating him. We remember the story of the FBI James Hosty and how he met up with Jack Rebel from Dallas DPD and told him in the hours after the assassination that we knew we had Oswald in our files. We knew he was a communist and he was capable of this. In other words, they had foreknowledge. We find out later that Lee Harvey Oswald himself was an FBI informant. Every time he got arrested, he was meeting with an FBI official. You know, in New Orleans, it was Quigley. In Dallas, it was Hosty. An FBI informant named Lee warned of the Chicago assassination 20 days prior. We found out that Jack Ruby was himself at one time an FBI informant. So it's just impossible. You have to suspend all your common sense to think the FBI did not have foreknowledge. Fourth question, how did the FBI control the narrative out of Dallas? The answer is they controlled it. It was Hoover. Hoover announced to the free world, first in a phone call to Bobby, which then spread through a memo to the FBI, and then in a White House Oval Office meeting with LBJ. And eventually LBJ took what Hoover told him, and he announced it from the White House Situation Room. What was the subject of all these communications? That Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and assassinated JFK. And it bled over into the Justice Department, resulting in a memo, an inter-office memo from Nicholas Katzenbach, which basically stipulated that this is after Oswald's death. The American people must be satisfied that Oswald acted alone. He did not have Confederates; they're still at large, and then he would have been convicted at a trial. And that became the marching orders going forward, setting in stone this narrative, which first came out of the mouth of J. Edgar Hoover. Next question. How did the FBI control the investigation after Dallas? That's easy. They roped in all the evidence, and then they became the final clearinghouse of all the evidence that made it to the Warren Commission. And evidence that was exculpatory towards Lee Harvey Oswald had a habit of disappearing, had a habit of being destroyed, had a habit of being suppressed, had a habit of being changed, altered, and evidence that was incriminating towards Lee Harvey Oswald had a disturbing pattern, or showed a disturbing pattern of being manipulated, maneuvered, planted, manufactured in some cases. And that's what the Warren Commission got. So that's how they handled the evidence in case after case after case. And it all went in one direction. None of the mistakes or the sloppiness, if you want to be generous in your description, happened to the benefit of Lee Harvey Oswald and the idea of a conspiracy. It was all to the detriment of Lee Harvey Oswald and a conspiracy. It was all to push the narrative. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Next question. How were FBI loose ends dealt with? We're going to be dealing with 3 more loose ends today. And of course, the easiest answer to that is they were killed, well, in a lot of cases. But some of them were discredited. Some of them their reputations were destroyed. Some of them were intentionally destroyed as far as their psychological makeup. They were put through a psyop of the FBI's doing to destroy their mind and ergo destroy their credibility. It was just negative consequences over and over and over again that happened to these FBI loose ends, or any of the loose ends, especially if they contradicted the narrative, up to and including even some of the conspirators themselves. You know, we saw the CIA made a determination that Hoover himself was going to be a problem to their Watergate plans because he had a relationship with Nixon. And whereas before he had covered for the CIA because he shared the same enemies, JFK, MLK, RFK, Malcolm X, Fredhampton, but Nixon was different. And again, going back to that Suite 8F group, Nixon and Hoover were part of that outfit. If you remember, they were in Dallas the night before the assassination at Clint Murchison's house, a party. Another member of that Suite 8F. They were on the same team, such as it were. He wasn't as close with Nixon as he was LBJ, but he was certainly not going to cover for the CIA going after Nixon. So they had to remove one of the conspirators. He became a loose end. And we told that story. All kinds of, we're going to tell some more stories today of other loose ends that were originally part of the conspiracy. That's the interesting thing about becoming part of these kinds of criminal conspiracies. You may think you're indispensable to the plot, but at some point, if deemed an obstacle to the plot going forward, or in some manner, shape, form, a threat to the narrative staying what you want it to stay, or a threat to the talk to investigative body or somebody in the media, whatever, they will get rid of you just as quick as they got rid of the original target. So anyway, that's loose ends. What payoffs were only possible with FBI complicity? We've hit on a couple. LBJ he didn't go to jail. He became president. J. Edgar Hoover became FBI director for life. Never had to worry about the Kennedys firing him anymore. We're going to talk more about payoffs in episode 13. And there were a lot of them to a lot of people. Next to last question. How did the FBI participate in the deep state's second presidential takedown, which was Nixon, Watergate? And the answer to that is, by Mark Felt ascending to the deputy director position after Hoover's death. Mark Felt, who was under the sway of the CIA, became the FBI's sort of point man in the investigation. And he directed or steered all the investigation away from the CIA, right straight at the White House, aimed the FBI's guns right straight at Richard Nixon. And then became the primary source, if you were to believe Bob Woodward, the deep throat source that, again, seconded that agenda, which was pointing everything at the White House and Richard Nixon. Now, I believe there were actually two sources who formed a composite, which Woodward identified as deep throat. And he had his FBI source, which was Mark Felt. He also has White House source, which I believe was Alexander Haig. And so the FBI was complicit in that way, in pointing everything in one direction. And of course, then the last question is, how did the FBI begin losing control of the narratives plural? And we'll get into that in episode 13, when all that evidence that I laid out a couple episodes ago, that per the FBI, here's the ballistics evidence. Per the FBI, here's this evidence, that evidence. I told you we'd eventually get around to rebutting it. It just took some time because all that was fed to the public in 1964. And it took some years. By the time we get to the House Select Committee hearings in the late 70s, you're talking 14, 15 years. And that's when a lot of the new evidence comes into play, which just, discredits the old evidence. And you start to see a pattern of FBI malfeasance that fed into the Warren Commission and eventually was laundered through the Warren commissioners into the Warren Report. And you realize just how big a role the FBI played in corrupting the evidence, which means they fed garbage to the Warren Commission, and the Warren Commission regurgitated that garbage in the form of the Warren Report, garbage in, garbage out. And it was the FBI acting in concert with the CIA, of course, always. But eventually, there's that old saying, a lie goes around the world 7 times before the truth gets out of town. And the truth does bubble to the surface. And you can fight like mad, and you can have control of the media through Operation Mockingbird, call everybody conspiracy theorists. You can corrupt the evidence, the documents, and even withhold the evidence and the documents for years and years and years. It doesn't matter. Eventually, the truth comes out. And it becomes a losing proposition over time, trying to remember all the lies. And so the truth being on the side of justice and the side of what I believe is the conspiracy to kill JFK, all the subsequent evidence, just like all the initial evidence was incriminating to Oswald, all the subsequent evidence has been exonerating towards Oswald and has pointed back at the very people who were in charge of the investigation to begin with, the foxes who were in charge of the hen house, so to speak. All right, so we have 3 stories to tell today. The first one sort of doubles down on the Watergate story that we were telling at the end of episode 11. And I've chosen as my overall date for this, December 8th, 1972. Now, there's some backstory that goes into December 8th, 1972. because I'm telling the story of Dorothy Hunt, who was the wife of E. Howard Hunt. And of course, E. Howard Hunt is the one Nixon is very concerned about. He was one of the seven arrested at Watergate. And when Nixon saw his name, he just about lost his mind. And we didn't know it at the time. He was playing it cool as a cucumber publicly, saying it was a third rate burglary, no big deal. But we finally got access to the White House tapes, which in real time showed just how concerned he was, especially with respect to E. Howard Hunt. And uh, now, on my other channel, I did an entire series in my JFK series about E. Howard Hunt. I get into all the details and the history between him and Nixon, and it's pretty extensive. I'll give you the thumbnail view in this episode, but understand Nixon was vice president in 1952 to 60. This is 1972. And as such, according to the national security law that was passed in 47, the act that was passed, which created the CIA, it simultaneously created, that was what everybody knew existed. And of course, their mandate was to collect intelligence uh, and interpret it for the daily reports to the president. That was their mandate. Nobody knew about the classified part of the bill, which was a super secret subcommittee called 5412 Committee, which enabled the CIA uh, to launch covert operations, actual operations in the interest of stopping the spread of communism. And it established as a pecking order the vice president, whomever the vice president was in charge of that committee. He was the chairperson. And as such, if he could justify that they needed a covert operation to stop the spread of communism anywhere in the world, they had carte blanche power to do so. Unlimited black budget. Nobody knew where the money was going, how much money it was spending, what its operations were. It was all classified. Not only did the American people not know that the CIA was involved in covert ops, it didn't even know about the 5412. It was all super classified. And as such, that means Nixon was over this 5412 committee. And of course, we know that the 50s, the CIA ran wild around the world, launching one covert op after another. Iran, Guatemala, Cuba, down in Latin America, all over the place. And of course, that means Nixon was working hand in glove with these CIA covert operators. One of these covert operators was Lee Howard Hunt. So this relationship goes back at the time that in question here, 1972, this relationship goes back 20 years. And Nixon knows it, as we will see in the tapes. Howard Hunt knows it, and his wife know it. And now they find themselves in trouble. And so one of the, you go back through all those operations, and an argument could be made by a public figure like Nixon, if he ever gets blackmailed on this stuff, that what happened in Iran was legitimate. What happened in Guatemala was legitimate. What was happening in Cuba was legitimate. And he could make an argument. It doesn't hold much water, especially the Iran Guatemala stuff, but at least he could make that argument. What he couldn't make an argument for was a super secret assassination team that he had created, off the books assassination team. That sole purpose was to take out Castro before the 60 election. Nixon could get credit for it. He'd win the election. And I tell this story in that other channel in my JFK series about the S Force and how it was created. It was all these Santos Traficante gunmen. That's why they call it the S Force. It was Santos's guys. They had to be Cuban because they had to infiltrate Cuban society, get close to Castro and kill him. And they were training at Clint Murchison's house. There's that name again, down in Mexico. And the training was very specific, and it was CIA trainers William Rip Robertson, Carl Jenkins were the two trainers. And they were training this assassination team, which they call a triangular fire team, to shoot at a moving target from distance with high-powered rifles and scopes. That was their training. Well, uh, everybody assumed that Nixon would win the 60 election, but it didn't happen. Kennedy won the 60 election, which means Nixon loses control over the 5412 committee and this super secret assassination team. Kennedy comes into power, and instead of doubling down on the Nixon Eisenhower policy towards Cuba, he starts pulling back. And he okays the Bay of Pigs, but not the invasion, right? Which is what the CIA wanted, which Bay of Pigs was always intended to fail, force his hand, launch an invasion, clean up the mess. He said no. Then the next year, it was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, the same people came to him, used this as a pretext, a do-over for Bay of Pigs, and invade Cuba or bomb the missile site. Again, he said no. And then by 63, he was actually negotiating secretly through a back channel with Castro to normalize relations. So what happens is these folks that want to assassinate Castro realize the real problem is Kennedy. He's not going to let us get close to him. He's not going to green light this sort of an operation, whereas Nixon would have. And so the new enemy, the new target becomes Kennedy instead, which they just switched the target. They used the same means, the same training, the same method. It was triangular fire, uh, at least 3 teams, possibly more. They shot at a moving target from distance with high-powered rifles and scopes. I mean, it just, and of course, Nixon's in Dallas on that weekend, and and it didn't take him long to realize after the assassination that these were his guys, and that was a secret he wanted to take with him to his grave. Well, problem is, guys like E. Howard Hunt know this secret. And now that he finds himself in trouble, they begin using what they know against Nixon to blackmail the White House in exchange for their silence about Watergate. And Dorothy Hunt was in charge. She was the liaison. She was the one that negotiated this blackmail at the White House. She's the go-between. One of the other burglars, James McCord, said that when she was talking with McCord, she told McCord that her husband had information that could blow the White House out of the water. Another fellow involved in this caper, Sherman Skolnick, who was an investigator into Watergate, he actually took it a step further and he said, the assumption was that the information that he had was about Watergate. That was what McCord thought, because Dorothy wasn't specific, didn't elaborate. But Sherman Skolnick said, no, this is bigger than Watergate. It reaches back into classified operations that are tied to the Kennedy assassination. Uh-oh. So, and of course, only Hunt and Nixon know what each other knows. And what they know together is that both have been working in these clandestine covert operations since 1952, essentially the early 50s. And here it is, 1972. 20 years is a lot of time to accumulate skeletons in the closet when you're both involved in covert operations like these two had been. Nixon as the head of the 5412 committee, and the guy who put this secret S-Force together, and Hunt, who was one of these CIA covert operators. So this is all corroborated, by the way, in the White House tapes later when we find out that Nixon is okaying, he is given the green light to pay the hush money to these burglars as a result of this blackmail. Anyway, according to Charles Colson, the White House special counsel was trying to keep a lid on everything for Nixon in the White House. He says that Dorothy told him in their negotiations, quote, if Nixon doesn't pay heavy to suppress the documents that we have showing that he is implicated in the planning and carrying out by the FBI and the CIA of the political murder of President Kennedy. She think about what she's saying. She's saying Nixon was involved, the FBI was involved, the CIA was involved, and then she finished up. She says, "We will blow the White House out of the water." No kidding. She's, uh, you know, think about the kinds of enemies the Hunts have right now uh, because of the knowledge that they have. The FBI, the CIA, and the White House. You don't get much higher level in terms of enemies than those three entities. This becomes the American people's introduction to Eduardo, which was the CIA code name for E. Howard Hunt. These covert operators are covert because they're secret and they're supposed to stay that way, hidden in the background, in the ether, and they operate in the shadows. And that's what a spook is, right? A CIA spook. It's you hang on to that. It becomes a weapon that you can use, your anonymity. Well, now all of a sudden, having been arrested at Watergate, your picture, along with six others, splashed across the New York Times, above the fold picture headline. And now that it's revealed to the judge that you are CIA, well, now every news reporter and investigator out there is digging into your background. And this becomes an untenable position for the CIA that one of their own, actually, six of theirs, but especially Hunt, because he's not just a useful instrument. Hunt's been an officer, an agent, a full-fledged agent. He's been one of these guys in charge. And now all of this is at risk of coming out, not just from the outside people who are investigating or curious about his background, but from himself and his wife who are threatening to spill the beans. This goes to my earlier point about how you can be a conspirator on the inside and think you're safe because you're part of the inner sanctum, the conspiracy. But at some point, if you become a threat yourself, a loose end yourself, then all of a sudden the target is now on you. That's eventually going to happen to Hunt, to his family. But he does his best to try to keep up the appearance of not being involved in all these covert operations going back and not being in Dallas on the day JFK died. He denies for years. But eventually the evidence, as I mentioned earlier, the truth starts to bubble to the surface and too much information, too much evidence tying him to Dallas comes out. There was that trial and he brought this on himself, the whole Marina Lorenz trial, the Liberty Lobby lawsuit, which it's the one time evidence of CIA complicity in the JFK assassination. It was a civil trial, so nobody went to jail. But he was suing because somebody had, in a news article, associated him with the JFK assassination and the CIA by extension. And he sued for defamation. Originally, he won, but then on appeal during this Liberty Lobby lawsuit, he loses based in part on the testimony of Marina Lorenz, who named him and went through all these details. She was part of Operation 40. She was part of the trip to Dallas to run the guns that eventually killed the president. She was there. E. Howard Hunt paid Frank Sturgis. She saw. So as a result of all that testimony to that trial, the jury foreman, they ruled against Hunt, and the jury foreman came out and said, there's no question, as a result of the testimony of Marina Lorenz, E. Howard Hunt, the CIA, killed the president. He should have never pursued that lawsuit. So it's events like that as time goes on that made it untenable for the CIA to keep defending him. And at some point, later, and after a period of time had gone by, they had to disavow him and say, well, he went rogue. If he was no question part of the assassination, he was in Dallas, but he was not there as part of an institutional plot. He went rogue. That became their limited hangout when information tying CIA agents to Dallas would inevitably emerge. They well, he went rogue, or he went rogue, and but this is the beginning of the end for E. Howard Hunt, Watergate, and not just for him, but for his wife. Um, Here's a picture of them on the front page. Now, these are the three primary operators when it comes to Watergate. You had G. Gordon Liddy on the left, former FBI guy. You have Hunt in the middle, and he was still working for the CIA, as we learned, reporting back all the information to his bosses. And then Frank McCourt on the right, also currently, they were advertised as being retired, but they weren't, and they were funneling information back to the CIA. But the one that concerns Nixon the most is the one in the middle. And this is in his own words. Nixon on the tapes said, quote, "This Hunt guy is the key." He's talking to his White House staff, his counsel, his chief of staff, Haldeman, counsel John Dean, Chuck Colson, et cetera, et cetera. He said, "This Hunt guy is the key. He's the lever. He will uncover a lot of things. Tell them," he's saying to his people, tell the CIA to tell the FBI, if they open that scab, there's a hell of a lot of things that will come out. Tell them that we feel it will be very detrimental to all of us if this thing goes any further. So the assumption is, as you listen to that tape, is that he is scared to death of what E. Howard Hunt knows about Watergate. Well, then, as you start to continue to dig deeper into these tapes, you find out, no, he never mentions Watergate. He's concerned about something he calls the Bay of Pigs thing. He says, quote, "If this gets out, it would make," this is on the same tape, "it would make the CIA look bad. It's likely to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing, which I think would be very bad for both the CIA and the country." And the question is, well, why does Nixon care about the whole Bay of Pigs thing? That happened on Kennedy's watch in '61. Why is he so, at first you might think, well, he's concerned about Kennedy's legacy, or the country's like the CIA's legacy. And initially, people didn't read too much into this, quote, whole Bay of Pigs thing he keeps referring to. But then as you listen to more of the tapes, you realize he's obsessed with this Bay of Pigs thing. He says, quote, the same tape again, "You have to keep investigators away from this. We got to get this shut off. We've got to shut this investigation down because this involves okay, now he's fixing to tell us, a covert operation that happened a long time ago." Well, that would, Bay of Pigs happened a long time ago. It's not covert. Everybody knew about it. Everybody knows about it. But let's play along. He says, "I was involved in it." Wait a second. You were involved in it. Well, we know that Nixon helped plan the Bay of Pigs, but then when there was a changeover in the administration, he was no longer involved in it. He says, "I was involved in it." And it involves these Bay of Pigs guys. So, okay, it's the same. So, what he's saying is these guys that just got arrested at Watergate are the same guys that were at the Bay of Pigs. He says it involves these Bay of Pigs guys that were in the Watergate hotel. So if you're following along at this point, you're still thinking he's obsessing about the original Bay of Pigs. Why? I'm not real sure, but in his own words, he's clearly concerned about it. And then he says, it was an extremely sensitive operation. Well, no kidding. It just went bad, right? And then he says something that should have just alarmed everybody in Washington and stopped everybody in their tracks. He says, something different than the Bay of Pigs invasion itself. So all of this talk about the Bay of Pigs and the Bay of Pigs guys and how the Bay of Pigs guys were in the Watergate Hotel and this extremely sensitive operation. The assumption was all this time at first he was talking about Watergate. Then they realized now he's talking about the Bay of Pigs. Now they realize it's something different from the Bay of Pigs operation or invasion itself. It's a deep and serious problem, and you have to do everything you can to keep this information from coming out. So naturally, the question is, what the hell is he talking about? In that tape, just as he's getting to a part where it's clear he's going to be explaining to people in his inner sanctum what exactly E. Howard Hunt knows that he could use as blackmail against him, and why it's so important to shut down E. Howard Hunt by any means necessary. The tape goes silent for the next 18 and a half minutes. It's just a gap. It's like it's just disappeared into the ether. And when they questioned his White House counsel about, because Dean was present at that meeting, they said, well, why'd the tape shut off and then come back on after the conversation was over? Dean's, I don't know, And when Nixon was asked about it, or his chief of staff, they claimed ignorance. They said, oh, it was some sinister force. I don't know what happened. It's like the dog ate my homework kind of thing. And then when they asked Dean, you were sitting there, since there's no record of it now, the tape's been erased, what did he say? Dean says, I can't remember. You know what that means when a politician says he can't remember. However, the FBI knew what John Dean had heard in that conversation, because they had wiretapped his lawyer's office. And when John Dean met with his lawyer, because he himself was in legal jeopardy, he had told his lawyer everything that was on that tape, including what was in that 18 and a half minutes, and why it was so important that this hush money be paid, this cover up be maintained. And so the FBI knew. Now remember, the FBI knows this, which means Deep Throat knows, right? Mark Felt, which means it could make it into the Washington Post at some point as a result of a conversation he would have with Bob Woodward. And what the FBI found out was that 18 and a half minute gap concerned Nixon's ties to the JFK assassination. And what became clear pretty quick was that Nixon was more concerned about the JFK assassination and his ties to it, and what E. Howard Hunt could confirm or corroborate as his ties to JFK assassination, than he ever was Watergate. He never talked about Watergate. Now, he kept talking about Bay of Pigs and Bay of Pigs guys, but we now know that he's talking about a different operation. And that was the 18.5 minute gap was the first clue that special extra sensitive operation was Dallas, was the JFK assassination. But they didn't have any hard evidence that that's what Nixon was referring to until White House Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman testified when they asked him, what's your boss talking about? When he talks about the Bay of Pigs and the Bay of Pigs guys and this extra sensitive operation that was something different than the Bay of Pigs invasion. And that 18.5 minute gap, something to do with the JFK assassination, according to the FBI. What the hell's going on? What is your boss talking about? And Haldeman just casually told him. And this just caused everything to go quiet. This is an open hearing. This should have been like the shot heard around the world. This should have stopped every bit of the Watergate investigation in its tracks, and it should have gone off in a new direction at this point. This was the opportunity to unwind everything going back to 63. He says, well, whenever President Nixon uses the term Bay of Pigs, that is his code for the JFK assassination. Oh, what? The whole tape is full of references to the Bay of Pigs. It's just one Bay of Pigs reference after another. Bay of Pigs guys, Bay of Pigs, how it's going to be detrimental to the CIA, detrimental to the country, And then in the 18.5 minute gap, which we don't hear, but the FBI hears, he lays it out in clear, plain terms to his underlings. We have got to silence Hunt because this all leads back to the JFK assassination. And now we have Haldeman confirming that. So this is the point at which the Watergate hearings should have become it should have just gone back and said, okay, we're gonna get to the bottom of this. And if that takes us all the way back to the JFK assassination, we have to reopen that. So be it. We have finally some of the players on the record now, and we haven't caught the current scandal, and they're clearly tied to a past event, which they're more concerned about than the current scandal. And of course, it comes out in the conversations on the tapes that Nixon confirms that 5 of the 7 burglars arrested, 5 of the 7 burglars arrested at Watergate were in Dallas. The only ones that weren't there were McCord and G. Gordon Liddy. But all the other 5, including E. Howard Hunt, were. And so you see why Nixon was so paranoid and why E. Howard Hunt was the key or the lever, as he mentioned. So they're in the middle of this blackmail operation. And 6 months goes by, and it's getting increasingly difficult because of the light that is now on the White House and creep. It's getting increasingly more and more difficult to pay this hush money. And they are raising their demands, wanting more money. So we're headed for a rock and a hard place kind of a scenario, because Nixon is trying to extricate himself from this hush money and this extortion, this blackmail. The Hunts are trying to increase their demands to pay, because legal fees are not cheap, and all of these burglars are paying these legal fees, and they need money. And this hush money, this payments, got to keep coming from the White House. Anyway, at some point, it becomes clear to the Hunts that they're losing their leverage as time goes by, because more and more evidence is coming out, which is damning to the White House. And I don't know, it might be a scenario where, and I don't know this for a fact, but it might be also a scenario where the Hunts realize if they go through with their threats and tell what they know about Nixon in this effort to get money, hush money, out of the White House, it's also going to put them in jeopardy with the CIA and the FBI, which is a completely different ball of wax. Because right now the CIA and the FBI are not involved in this scandal. Even though they were, it's all being steered and aimed and directed at the White House and Nixon. And the CIA will move heaven and earth. The FBI will move heaven and earth to keep it that way. And I think Dorothy and E. Howard Hunt, her husband, having both been in CIA, that's something I forgot to mention. You might ask, well, what was Dorothy's experience with the CIA? Why would she be chosen by her husband to be the liaison or the go-between? Dorothy Hunt was herself a CIA agent. So she was just as steeped in this intelligence world as he was. She worked as a liaison between the U.S. embassies and the intelligence operations over in Europe and Asia after World War II. And so she knew how things worked, right? Just like he did. And so they're playing this dangerous game. But at some point, I think they realize Nixon is in too deep, and we're losing leverage on him, because where this is headed, everything is going in the direction of impeachment. He's not going to last. He's not going to make it. And so, but we can save ourselves. If we go down this road and tell this story, we now make instant enemies of the CIA and the FBI. And so they're trying to play this dangerous game where I think maybe they were a little bit unsure of what to do next. They've got this information that could just royally screw Nixon, but it would royally screw them as well in the process because of the enemies that they would create. Nevertheless, in spite of that, they were so desperate for money, and the threat was always there that their co-conspirators, these other burglars, were going to come forward with what they knew. And the pressure was building because the legal fees were climbing, getting bigger by the day, and they were running out of money. So 6 months after Watergate, Dorothy Hunt decides to go public with her story, and her rationale about going public, I think, is a sound one. If you go public through a news reporter, then you bring so much light onto the case, onto yourself, that it serves as a form of protection, right? The blackmail, maybe if you tell Congress or the investigators, or you testify in a closed hearing, whatever, the public might not ever hear it, but she decides to go public with it. And she boards a United Airlines flight 533 from Washington, D.C. to Chicago. And she's with two people, a CBS News reporter named Michelle Clark and a congressman named George Collins. And they're going together to Chicago to hold a press conference. And at this press conference, Dorothy plans to go public with all the evidence she had of Nixon's involvement in Watergate and the JFK assassination. I mean, she's going to lay it out. We came this close. And instead, and she was also, she had a bunch of cash with her, $10,000, $100 bills, and she was going to pay off Michael Stevens, who was the owner of Stevens Research Labs in Chicago. He had provided a bunch of the surveillance equipment that they used in these dirty tricks, plumbers' operations, the Watergate burglaries, etc. And he hadn't been paid yet. So here's another guy who's itching to be paid, who could be a loose end. So she's going to pay him to keep him quiet and satisfy that, pay that invoice. But at the same time, she's going to hold this press conference. And this is going to be, you think about how history would have changed if she would have been able to hold that press conference. Instead, the plane crashes over Chicago in a very suspicious fashion. It was just like it exploded in midair. And it landed over. Well, it just rained down all this wreckage on a neighborhood, just like a residential neighborhood. Of course, everybody on board was killed. They went through Hunt's luggage. They found $10,000 in cash, $100 bills. And they discovered that before she boarded, because Dorothy was paranoid and she thought she was probably at risk, she had bought $250,000 in flight insurance payable to her husband, E. Howard Hunt. What was interesting about the aftermath, within minutes of the crash, guess who shows up on the scene with over 50 agents? It's the FBI. It's almost like they had been waiting. And when the plane fell out of the sky, they were already cordoning off the area containing the wreckage. They wouldn't let the air traffic control in, the NTSB, who normally investigates these kind of crashes. They sealed off the area with these 50 agents. Now, later, when they were confronted about this, why were you in charge of this is outside your purview, this is outside your jurisdiction. What in the hell are you doing? And the FBI said, well, we just had a few agents on the ground, happened to be local. They responded to an emergency. They said, well, how many? And they said 12. And then, as is always the case, as people start looking into it, they found out that there were well over 50 agents, and the FBI later had to concede to that. And so the FBI was on, clearly had these men at the ready. And when that plane fell out of the sky, they pounced. And they pounced so quickly, they cordoned off the area with the yellow tape, and no one else could get in. No one else could act as and do what they normally do in these situations. This is an unprecedented and illegal intervention by the FBI. And the whole thing stinks to high heaven because it was, you think about the collateral damage just to get one woman who was threatening to talk. This is how it goes with loose ends who become threats to the narrative. The narrative is not just the narrative with respect to one deep state plot. This goes back to two deep state plots, the JFK assassination, Watergate. And they have a lot invested in those two conspiracies. And a loose end like Dorothy, if it means collateral damage, innocent passengers in the plane, if it means collateral damage on the ground, innocent people in their houses, they all have to die to get one person. So be it. And of course, E. Howard Hunt knew. It's one of the reasons. It's an interesting story when you listen to him talk to his son, St. John, on his deathbed, when he finally confessed to his role in the JFK assassination, when he finally confessed that he was in Dallas on the day JFK died, and how he kept it quiet all these years. He told his son he had to keep it quiet for their safety. These folks had already killed their mother. And this was a message to E. Howard Hunt that no one in your family is safe. And not yourself, not your wife, not your kids. And so E. Howard Hunt literally took this secret almost to his grave. I talk about that in the E. Howard Hunt series about his deathbed confession. And so, what a message that E. Howard Hunt got. He got the message. So that was 72. We'll skip it ahead 5 years to 77. Here's another guy that was involved. So there's Hunt. He's involved in this series of conspiracies, not just one. By his own admission, JFK and Watergate. And he or his family becomes a target because they become a loose end. Well, here is Oswald's first handler after he returns from Russia down in Dallas, George demohrenschildt, who also becomes a target. And I've picked March 29, 1977 as the date in question because that's the day he dies. But again, there's some backstory. And, demohrenschildt had his background. He was very well educated, very kind of a I don't know, he's a well-traveled man, well-rounded in his education. He was a socialite. He was a ladies' man. He was all the things that Lee Harvey Oswald was not. And Edward J. Epstein from Reader's Digest had always been curious about why demohrenschildt and Oswald were paired together. The public story was that demohrenschildt approached Oswald and befriended him. And it didn't ring true. It didn't make any sense to Epstein, especially when you consider demohrenschildt's background. His family fled during the Russian Revolution for their lives. And they became part of the white Russian community. If you remember that revolution, it was whites versus reds, and the reds won, the communists won. So the whites had to flee for their lives. And demohrenschildt ends up in America as part of like a refugee with other refugees in the Dallas area that formed what was called the white Russian community. These are all these folks that fled Russia because they were not communist. And when the communists took over to save their lives, they had to flee, and they came to America, some of them. So he's part of this white Russian community. And so Epstein's thinking, there's nothing about demohrenschildt that links him with a guy like Oswald. I mean, even their ages. DeMorenschildt could be his father. And socially, they don't mix in the same circles. But he has all this education. Oswald's a high school dropout. Uh, DeMorenschildt is a white Russian, uh, conservative, a member of all these far right organizations in Dallas, along with the Clint Murchisons of the world, the Hunts of the world, etc. That's the company. He's part of that Suite 8F type company, the elites. What's he doing mixing with Oswald, who's not only not a white Russian, he claims to be a Marxist. He just got back from Russia. He claims he's a Marxist. What in the world put these two together? So he's asking DeMorenschildt in this interview in 77. So you're 14 years removed from the assassination. And DeMorenschildt is showing a willingness to talk and say things that he's never said before. And Epstein is the beneficiary. He says in 62, this is DeMorenschildt talking, that he was contacted by J. Walton Moore, who's the CIA station chief in Dallas. And according to DeMorenschildt, Moore said, we need you to handle or be Lee Harvey Oswald's handler when he gets back from Russia. He's going to be assigned down here to Dallas. We need you to be his handler. In exchange, he was an oil geologist, is what he was, which means he knew where the oil was. This is why he was friends with Murchison and Richardson and Hunt and all these people, because they hired him to, as they wildcatted their way across Texas looking to strike more and more oil. They needed a guy like DeMorenschildt to tell them where the oil was. And that's how he made his money. Well, he was at that time trying to negotiate a contract for an oil deal in Haiti, and he needed to help the United States government, State Department, etc. And they said, if you'll do this favor for us and handle our asset, we'll do a favor for you and help greenlight that contract between you and Haiti. And that was in 62. So from 62 to 63, March, he handles Oswald. And in March, he hands off Oswald to Michael and Ruth Paine, because at that point, we're getting closer to the assassination. And out of necessity, there's going to be a need to separate Lee and Marina. So you need a husband and wife handler team now, whereas in the past, you just needed somebody to handle Oswald. So his job was finished. And sure enough, keeping their word, the CIA and the United States government helped DeMorenschildt get that contract, the Haitian government. And so he left the country at the end of March and went to Haiti to oversee this oil project. He was actually out of the country when the assassination happened. So it was a quid pro quo. You handle Oswald for us. And he had done other projects for them in the past. That's how they knew each other. And he circulated in that world with all these Suite 8Fers, these big business, these big oil guys. And they're far right, John Birch type societies. They had all kinds of I did a whole video on George DeMorenschildt, all these extreme right-wing organizations that were operating in Dallas at that time that all the same people belonged to. It's amazing. Very small clique of people. So in March, he hands him off to Michael and Ruth Paine. According to Epstein's diary, he's writing to himself. He says, then this morning, this is March 29th, 77, I asked him about why he, a socialite in Dallas, sought out Oswald, a defector. And according to Epstein, he said his explanation, if believed, put the assassination in a new and unnerving context. He said that although he had never been a paid employee of the CIA, he had on occasion done favors for CIA-connected officials. In turn, they had helped in his business contacts overseas. That's how he got paid. He got paid in these approved contracts, these oil deals. So that was the morning. He never got a chance to resume the interview in the afternoon because when they broke for lunch, they went their separate ways. And when Demohrenschildt returned to his room, he was living in Florida at the time with his daughter, who herself was a socialite. You know, Daddy had a lot of money. When Demohrenschildt returned to his room, he found an invitation. Gayton Fonzie, an investigator at the House Select Committee, which was just cranking up at the time, had found him and knew that Mohrenschildt was talking to Epstein and might be willing to talk to the House Select Committee. And he is a very important source in all things related to the JFK assassination. And he had testified before the Warren Commission and stuff remotely from Haiti, where he was at. But he hadn't said anything. But now he's starting to talk, as evidenced by the interview with Epstein. So he gets back and he sees this invite. And a little bit later, his daughter gets back from her. She had gone to play in a bridge tournament that morning. When she came back that afternoon, she found her dad dead in a chair, slooped over, a massive gunshot wound to the head, and a 20-gauge double-barreled shotgun was lying on the floor next to him. And it looked like he committed suicide. Now, what she later discovered was that on a tape, an audio recording that she had instructed her maid to make of her favorite soap opera while she was gone, that tape continued to run while her dad was killed. In other words, it was recording her soap opera, but caught in the background what happened to her dad. And so she was playing it and she's listening to it and she hears the gunshot. So she replays it, and she eventually gives this evidence to Mark Lane, the attorney. And according to Mark Lane, as they're listening to it together, they're trying to identify all the sounds to get any clues about what happened to her dad. And right before he was shot, there was a beep, 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 beep sound that came up on the audio recording right before the shots, or the shot. So Mark Lane asked her, "What's the beep, beep, beep sound?" She said, "That's my alarm." And Mark Lane was like, "Well, what does that mean? Is it does it go off every hour? Is it automatic?" "Well, no, it means someone has entered. There's an intruder." So it means, she says, there's 3 settings. There's a high mode, a medium mode, and a low mode. The low mode means it's turned off. There's no sound at all. The medium mode means that if there's an intruder, it beep, 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 beeps and notifies the homeowner only through the beep, beep, beep. The high mode, there's a siren, which, in addition to notifying the homeowner, it also notifies the local police. She said, when I left, I put it on medium. So that beep, beep, beep is an intruder notification to the homeowner. Of course, I'm not there. The maid's there. My dad was there. So Mark Lane, realizing this is evidence, you figure how this is sequenced. The recording is running. It's capturing the soap opera. Then there's a beep, 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 beep. Then there's a gunshot. And so he presents this evidence to the district attorney saying, I think there was an intruder who shot George Mohrenschildt. And here's the evidence. The alarm system went off You can hear the beep, beep, beep. You know it went off, and then you hear the gunshot. We know somebody was in that room. And after the beep, 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 and we know it was an intruder because they didn't have the code. George Demohrenschildt, when he came back from lunch, pushed in the code. There's no beep, beep, beep. The maid knew the code. The only two people in the house that were there knew the code. This was an intruder, followed by a gunshot. The DA told him, quote, "We're not going to go into that." Later, at the coroner's inquest, he presents the tape again. And the woman said, that's who's present at this coroner's inquest. One of the women there said, that's just like my own security system. That's how mine works. It's on medium mode. Beep, 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 beep. And the DA sitting there and he told her and everybody at the coroner's inquest, again, he said the same thing. We're not going to go into that. So they rule it a suicide. Where have you heard that before? Demohrenschildt's connections, as I've indicated earlier, are deep in Dallas, in the business world with the big oil people, but also with the CIA, who contacted him about being their handler. These are the same intersecting connections that FBI Director Hoover had. Now, Hoover's not around anymore, but it's the same. So here we find another sweet 8F'er who becomes a loose end, just like Hoover became a loose end at some point, was going to stand in the way of the Watergate operation, had to be taken out. Now we find George Demohrenschildt, a loose end, had to be taken out. He was about ready to talk to the House Select Committee. Demohrenschildt's wife maintained, she said, "I do not accept that he committed suicide. They may get me too, but I'm not afraid. It's about time somebody looked into this thing." And so here's another case of a loose end who is somebody deeply connected, not only to the Sweet 8F Mafia, which means that just like Hoover was, but also to Oswald. He was his handler. And also to the CIA. See, this guy's connected to the FBI, the CIA, the Sweet 8F, and Oswald. I mean, he's about as connected as you can get, which is why he was a loose end, now that he was willing to talk. So that's two stories so far. 72, it was Dorothy Hunt. She became a threat because she was going to go public. And it was going to expose, she had documents, it was going to expose the CIA, the FBI, and Richard Nixon and their role, not just in Watergate, but also the JFK assassination. So plane crash takes her out. Now we've got George Demohrenschildt, who knows the secrets about Oswald and why he was doing the things in Dallas he was doing. He was being ordered. This was going to expose the CIA. Obviously, the fact that he was working for the CIA, handling a CIA asset, it's just a matter of time before his testimony confirms that Oswald was CIA. Ergo, the CIA killed the president. So he has to be taken out. That brings us to the third loose end. That's William Sullivan. This guy's a longtime FBI official. He joined during World War II, and he sort of rose through the ranks because he became a trusted confidant of the director, J. Edgar Hoover. Eventually, he got appointed assistant director of the FBI's intelligence division, and then he rose to number 3 in the FBI behind Hoover, Clyde Tolson, and then there was William Sullivan. I think it's important at this point to stipulate that Sullivan was a trusted confidant of Hoover, which is why he rose to the ranks, got promoted the way he did, because he agreed with Hoover on everything. He had the same view of the world his boss had: anti-communism, anti-civil rights. And so Hoover trusted him. He placed him in charge of the FBI's Division 5, which sole purpose was to smear the leaders of left-wing organizations like radicals or communists or civil rights leaders in order to discredit their organizations. It's COINTELPRO. And his job was the propaganda part of it. And the reason this guy becomes important is because during this period of time, he gets put in charge of three of the most high-profile investigations during this era. One is the assassination in Dallas, the JFK assassination. He's in charge of the FBI investigation, and he's working hand in hand with a guy named John Whitten, who's in charge of the CIA investigation. And they are sharing the workload, working together. So here's further corroboration of FBI and CIA, sort of like a confederacy that has emerged between the two, where they're working as partners, covering for each other, and now they're working together in investigation. No doubt covering for each other again. Well, Whitten turned out to be a straight shooter, an honest broker. Uh-oh, that doesn't go over well in the CIA, right? He's sort of the black sheep of the family, so to speak. So he came to believe that Sullivan's boss, Hoover, and his boss, CIA Director Richard Helms, were withholding evidence from him. Here he's trying to carry out this investigation, and he's really focused in on Oswald. And there's certain pieces of evidence from his superiors. Well, his superior was Helms. Sullivan's superior was Hoover, that he can't get his hands on. Like, for example, Oswald allegedly being photographed at the Cuban consulate in October 60. That's that Mexico City story. But once the CIA learned that nobody believed that those pictures were Oswald, those pictures disappeared. He couldn't get his hands on. Another piece of evidence was the fact that Oswald allegedly visited the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. Remember that story where he met with Comrade Kostikov, the KGB assassination specialist who was helping Oswald plan the assassination. Well, the guy that they had on recordings, the FBI had determined that those voice recordings did not match Oswald. So all of a sudden that evidence disappeared. Then the existence of a CIA 201 file, personnel record, indicating that Oswald had been an asset of the CIA for how many years, he couldn't find out, because the file, which had been maintained for years by James Jesus Angleton, was withheld from him, again, by his own boss. So evidence was very important, and would have been exculpatory, clearly, of Oswald, because the photograph of him at the Cuban consulate was clearly not him. The recordings of Oswald at the Soviet embassy in Mexico was clearly not him. And the existence of a CIA 201 file means that the guy being blamed for the assassination was CIA. So they can't give him that. Anyway, he goes and he complains. He has a meeting with his boss, Richard Helms, and Helms realized, oh, this guy Whitten's going to be a problem. He's not playing ball. He's not taking one for the team here. He said, we need this evidence. We need to look at Oswald's pro-Castro political activities before the assassination. We need access to this, the pro-Castro stuff. There's no way Angleton or Helms is ever going to give that to Whitten once they realize Whitten's an honest broker here. Because that's all CIA activity. That's all coming out of David Atlee Phillips' propaganda machine down in Mexico City, creating this sheep dipping operation to make Oswald look like he's pro-Castro, so that Operation Northwoods would succeed, right? The whole Dallas thing was an Operation Northwoods, a false flag on American soil against an American target, blaming Cuba. The assassin's going to have all these ties to Cuba so that we invade Cuba afterwards. They're never going to give him this evidence. So Helms fires or takes Whitten off the case, what he does, reassigns him, and instead hands the case to James Jesus Angleton. That's the equivalent of putting uh, Alan Dulles on the Warren Commission. I mean, it's preposterous on its face. He's been in charge of this file. No doubt he knows the backstory on Oswald. He's the guy that ran him through the fake defector program and got him to Russia to begin with. He's been in charge of Oswald creating. They're putting him together like a cheap suit, right? And he's the guy, the mastermind behind it. Now he's in charge of the investigation. You can't make this stuff up. So the reports that come out of these investigations, both Sullivan's report from the FBI perspective and Angleton's report, the CIA's perspective, then became the basis upon which the Warren report was based. Literally, it's the input into the Warren Commission that they spit out in the form of a report, the Warren report. It's those two reports put together. So Sullivan is being clearly denied information from Hoover, and he came up with his flim flam report. Angleton participated in a cover up with Richard Helms to protect the CIA. He produced his report, and these two garbage reports became, once they were merged into one, the Warren report. Garbage in, garbage out. Well, Sullivan had his doubts about Oswald's guilt as a result of this investigation. He kept it to himself. It didn't come out until a book that he had published, that actually he had written, but it wasn't published until after he died, where he expressed those doubts. No doubt he knew, if I go around saying this in my current job, my current capacity as the number 3 guy at the FBI, that's going to put me at odds with my boss. And that's not a real healthy place to be. But in his book, which was, as I mentioned, was published after his death, he said, quote, Oswald didn't have a record of being an outstanding marksman, and yet he hit the president with 2 shots while his car was moving slowly down the road. His 3rd shot hit Governor Connolly. I went to the book depository from which Oswald fired at the president. I looked out the window where he was positioned. I've been around guns all my life, and I'm a reasonably good shot, but I must say that would be quite a task for me. It was, tragically, damn good shooting. So just keep this in mind. He's got doubts about the JFK narrative. Now, as I mentioned, he believed the same way his boss believed when it came to civil rights and communists. He wasn't as strident on the communist side as Hoover was, as we'll see later, but he was virulently anti-civil rights, especially MLK, because he thought he was a hypocrite. And we know that because he wrote this memo in 1964 to Hoover. He said, quote, it should be clear to all of us that King must, at some propitious point in the future, be revealed to the people of this country and to his Negro followers as being what he actually is, a fraud, demagogue, and scoundrel. When the true facts concerning his activities are presented, such should be enough, if handled properly, to take him off his pedestal, to reduce him completely in influence. You remember when he was in charge of Division 5, his job was to smear guys like MLK. This is what he's doing. Right? And of course, because of COINTELPRO, they have all this inside information on MLK. And what he's advocating through this memo to Hoover is we need to make this public. Everything we know, we need to make public. I wanted to include that so you have a window inside Sullivan's mind in 1964 and how it changes as time goes on. 4 years later, he becomes the lead investigator into the MLK death, which he should be happy about, right? We just saw the memo. And he was involved in the arrest of James Earl Ray, pictured here. After that whole scenario where they arrest and you have the trial of James Earl Ray, he begins to have doubts about James Earl Ray, which of course he keeps quiet. We don't find out about it until, again, his book is published after his death. He said, quote, "I was convinced that James Earl Ray killed Martin Luther King, but I doubt if he acted alone. Someone, I feel sure, taught Ray how to get a false Canadian passport, how to get out of the country, and how to travel to Europe because he could have never managed it alone. And how did Ray pay for the passport and airline tickets?" So he's raising doubts in his own mind that he wrote that later get published. Sullivan said that he came to believe that Ray was paid to kill King because when he interviewed Ray's brother told him, quote, "My brother would never do anything unless he was richly paid." And of course, we know the backstory about how Ray was set up by Hoover, and Sullivan is suspicious. So here's Patsy number 2 that Sullivan is expressing doubts about. Now he's on the inside of both of these investigations. So he knows a lot of what we didn't know at the time. And he's expressing doubts about this. So you can see his mind kind of working, but he's afraid to go public with it, right? Well, that same year, he was also involved in the FBI investigation of the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. And again, has doubts about the Patsy. And we know he has doubts because it gets published in this book after his death again. He says, quote, "We never found out why," speaking to motive, adding that there were so many holes in the case. We could never account for Sirhan's presence in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. Did he know Kennedy would be walking through? If so, how? You know, he's raising the same argument that could be raised about Lee Harvey Oswald when you hear the curtain rod story and how Wesley Buell Frazier says, "Well, yeah, he asked me for a ride on that Thursday morning, and he brought curtain rods with him. He said they were curtain rods. And then he told me he didn't need a ride on that Friday." And that became the FBI explanation for how he smuggled the man Arcano into the building, right? The obvious question is, how did Lee Harvey Oswald know on Thursday night, or Thursday morning when he brought him in, how did he know that the motorcade route was going to be changed on Friday morning to include a right-hand 90-degree turn onto Houston and a left turn, 90-degree turn onto Elm, bringing the motorcade and the presidential limo right in front of the Texas School Book Depository on that Thursday when he allegedly was sneaking this rifle into the building under the guise of curtain rods? The motorcade was still to go straight on Main. There's no way you're going to kill him from the Texas School Book Depository building if the motorcade's going straight on Main, which either means that whole curtain rod story is baloney and didn't happen, or assuming it's true and it did happen, that means Oswald had inside information that the next day they were going to change the motorcade route. That's the only two scenarios that make any sense, right? Well, here we have a similar situation where Bobby Kennedy was not supposed to go to the kitchen. It got rerouted at the last minute by his security detail, which had been infiltrated by Thane Eugene Caesar, a CIA contract operative who was posing as a security specialist. And he was the guy leading him literally with his hand on his shoulder, pushed him through into the kitchen, right into the line of fire where Sirhan was waiting for him. So what he is saying is, how did Sirhan know that he was going to be in the kitchen? He wasn't supposed to go through the kitchen. So either you had the same scenarios in Oswald. Either it didn't happen the way the government said it happened, or he had inside information, or somebody who was maneuvering Sirhan into place had inside information. And this was all contrived. It was all a plot. And that's what so he's bringing these issues up in his book. Now we get to the issue at hand where he becomes a loose end. It's clear in his own mind he's already a loose end, but he hasn't ever said anything publicly yet until 1971, right before Watergate, about a little less than a year before Hoover dies. Sullivan, for the first time, disagrees with Hoover about something. And it is about the threat the American Communist Party posed to the national security of the United States. He thought Hoover was wasting money going after this group, investigating this group, the American Communist Party. And he told him so. He wrote him a letter. And he said, I think this is a misallocation of resources. I don't think they're as big a national security threat as you do, as you think they are, et cetera, et cetera. And he didn't say so in so many words, but he suggested that Hoover might want to consider retirement. He wasn't trying to be ugly. He was just, maybe you've overstayed your welcome kind of a thing. And what used to be maybe a valid threat late 40s is no longer a valid threat anymore. Anyway, Hoover took that personal, as you might imagine. And Sullivan had to leave the FBI. I don't know if he was fired or what, but he had to leave the FBI. And shortly thereafter, in an interview with Bob Novak, he told him, quote, "Someday you will read that I have been killed in an accident, but don't believe it. I've been murdered." And November 9th, 1977, William Sullivan was shot dead near his home. Now, the story was that he was shot in a hunting accident by a fellow hunter named Robert Daniels. And he was charged. It was a $500 fine. He lost his hunting license for 10 years, et cetera, et cetera. It was supposedly a big accident. But there are a lot of accidents happening within the FBI in a 6-month period in 1977, which coincidentally was the same time period all of these former FBI officials, 6 of them, had been scheduled to testify before the House Select Committee. So in a 6-month period, approximately one per month, 6 top FBI officials, including this guy Sullivan, all died violent deaths in 1977, right around the time the House Select Committee was asking them to testify. So there's your third loose end. We had Dorothy Hunt, who was a threat to the CIA, the FBI, and the White House. They take her out in a plane crash. You have George Demohrenschildt, who was a threat to the CIA, a threat to the Suite 8F Mafia group, all those connections that he had, the Dallas elites, LBJ, Hoover, Hoover's FBI, the CIA people, the big oil people, etc. Could not have any revelation by George Demohrenschildt indicating that Oswald was CIA. And now you have Sullivan, who had doubts about all 3 patsies in those 3 cases that he investigated, expressed those posthumously in his book. And his confrontation with Hoover, no doubt, in Hoover's mind, at least, or in this happened, in fairness to Hoover, this happened in 77. So this is about 5 years after Hoover died. So somebody within the FBI realized that by the time we get to 77, Sullivan had become a loose end. I mean, the fact that he had left under the terms that he left, his book had come out, He's been saying publicly now that he has doubts about the three patsies, and now he's being asked to testify. And for all these years, he was the number 3 guy at the FBI. If anybody had secrets, Sullivan did. So that's what happens to loose ends in case after case after case. I'm just picking out some of the highlights. And right now, the topic of this series is the FBI. So I'm trying to find ones that are these loose ends that are related to the FBI or could expose the FBI or were threats to the FBI. Those are the ones in particular I'm looking at. We'd be here all day if we talked about everybody who died, who had information about the JFK assassination, for example. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining. Please feel free to subscribe to my channels, plural. I have 2 channels. I have the Standards Plus History Academy channel, which is all mostly JFK, and it's got a couple hundred videos on. And then this channel is the Treasonous Cabal, and this is about the deep state. And this is chapter 59, and chapter 60 is this is the penultimate video chapter, and chapter 60 will be the final one. So that'll be a pretty lengthy one, but we'll get to that later. So feel free to subscribe to my channels. Feel free to comment. Feel free to like. Feel free to share. And until next time, God bless. Thank you.